The boys of capital, they also chortle in their martinis about the death of socialism. The word has been banned from polite conversation, and they hope that no one will notice that every socialist experiment of any significance in the 20th century, without exception, has either been crushed, overthrown, or invaded, or corrupted, perverted, subverted, or destabilized, or otherwise had life made impossible for it by the United States and its allies. Not one socialist government or movement, from the Russian Revolution to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, from Communist China to the FMLN in El Salvador, not one was permitted to rise or fall solely on its own merits. Not one was left secure enough to drop its guard against the all-powerful enemy abroad and freely and fully relax control at home. It's as if the Wright brothers' first experiment with the flying machines all failed because the automobile interests sabotaged each test flight. And then the good and God-fearing folk of the world looked upon this, took notice of the consequences, nodded their collective heads wisely, and intoned sullenly, "Man shall never fly." The Philippines, 1940s and 1950s, America's oldest colony. Quote, "I walk the floor of the White House night after night until midnight, and I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed to Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And one night late it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but it came. 1. That we could not give them, the Philippine Islands, back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. 2. That we could not turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business and discreditable. 3. That we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule over there worse than Spain's was. And 4. That there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all, and to educate the Filipinos and uplift them and civilize them and Christianize them. And by God's grace, do the very best that we could by them, as our fellow men for whom Christ also died." End quote. William McKinley, President of the United States, 1899. William McKinley's idea of doing the very best by the Filipinos was to employ the United States Army to kill them in the tens of thousands, burn down their villages, subject them to torture, and lay the foundation for an economic exploitation which was proudly referred to at the time as imperialism by leading American statesmen and newspapers. After the Spanish had been driven out of the Philippines in 1898 by a combined action of the United States and the Filipinos, Spain agreed to cede, that is, sell, the islands to the United States for $20 million. But the Filipinos, who had already proclaimed their own independent republic, did not take kindly to being treated like a plot of uninhabited real estate. Accordingly, an American force numbering at least 50,000 proceeded to instill in the population a proper appreciation of their status. Thus did America's longest lasting and most conspicuous colony ever come into being. Nearly half a century later, the U.S. Army again landed in the Philippines to find a nationalist movement fighting against a common enemy, this time the Japanese. While combating the Japanese during 1945, the American military took many measures aimed at quashing this resistance army. The Huks, a shortening of Huk Balahap, quote, the People's Army Against Japan, end quote, in Tagalog. American forces disarmed many Huk units, removed the local governments which the Huks had established, and arrested and imprisoned many of their high-ranking members, as well as leaders of the Philippine Communist Party. Guerrilla forces primarily organized and led by American officers, and composed of U.S. and Filipino soldiers of the so-called U.S. Army forces in the Far East, undertook police-type actions which resulted in a virtual reign of terror against the Huks and suspected sympathizers. Disparaging rumors were spread about the Huks to erode their support amongst the peasants, and the Japanese were allowed to assault Huk forces unmolested. This, while the Huks were engaged in a major effort against the Japanese invaders and Filipino collaborators, and frequently came to the aid of American soldiers. In much of this anti-Huk campaign, the United States made use of Filipinos who were collaborating with the Japanese, such as landlords, large estate owners, many police constables, and other officials. In the post-war period, the U.S. restored to power and position many of those tainted with collaboration, much to the distaste of other Filipinos. The Huk guerrilla forces had been organized in 1942, largely at the initiative of the Communist Party, in response to the Japanese occupation of the islands. Amongst American policymakers, there were those who came to the routine conclusion that the Huks were thus no more than a tool of the international communist conspiracy, to be opposed as all such groups were to be opposed. Others in Washington and Manila, whose reflexes were less knee-jerk but more cynical, recognized that the Huk movement, if its growing influence was not checked, would lead to sweeping reforms of Philippine society. The centerpiece of the Huk political program was land reform, a crying need in this largely agricultural society. The communist Hukabalip rebellion, reported the New York Times, quote, is generally regarded as an outgrowth of the misery and discontent among the peasants of central Luzon, the main island, end quote. A study prepared years later for the U.S. Army echoed the sentiment, stating that the Huks, quote, main impetus was peasant grievances, not Leninist designs, end quote. By the end of 1945, 4 months after the close of World War II, the United States was training and equipping a force of 50,000 Filipino soldiers for the Cold War. In a testimony before a congressional committee, Major General William Arnold of the U.S. Army candidly stated that this program was, quote, essential for the maintenance of internal order, not for external difficulties at all, end quote. At the same time, American soldiers were kept on in the Philippines, and in at least one infantry division, combat training was reestablished. This led to vociferous protests and demonstrations by the GIs who wanted only to go home. The inauguration of combat training, the New York Times disclosed, was, quote, interpreted by soldiers and certain Filipino newspapers as the preparation for the repression of possible uprisings in the Philippines by disgruntled farm tenant groups, end quote. The story added that the soldiers had a lot to say, quote, on the subject of American armed intervention in China and the Netherland Indonesia, end quote, which was occurring at the same time. The Huks, though not trusting Philippine and U.S. authorities enough to voluntarily surrender their arms, did test the good faith of the government by taking part in the April 1946 national elections as part of a democratic alliance of liberal and socialist peasant political groups. As matters turned out, the commander-in-chief of the Huks, Luis Tarak, and several other alliance members and reform-minded candidates who won elections to Congress, 3 to the Senate and 7 to the House, were not allowed to take their seats under the transparent fiction that coercion had been used to influence voters. No investigation or review of the cases had even been carried out by the appropriate body, the Electoral Tribunal. The purpose of denying these candidates their seats was equally transparent. The government was thus able to push through Congress the controversial Philippine-U.S. Trade Act, passed by 2 votes more than required in the House, and by nothing to spare in the Senate, which yielded to the United States bountiful privileges and concessions in the Philippine economy, including, quote, equal rights in the development of the nation's natural resources and the operation of its public utilities, end quote. The parity provision was eventually extended to every sector of the Philippine economy. The debasement of the electoral process was followed by a wave of heavy brutality against the peasants carried out by the military, the police, and landlord goon squads. According to Louise Turok, in the months following the election, peasant villages were destroyed, more than 500 peasants and their leaders killed, and about 3 times that number jailed, tortured, maimed, or missing. The Hucks and others felt they had little alternative but to take up arms once again. Many demands were made of the Filipinos for the commercial advantage of the United States, but none for the social and political advantage of the Philippines. The American military was meanwhile assuring a home for itself in the Philippines. A 1947 agreement provided sites for 23 U.S. military bases in the country. The agreement was to last for 99 years. By the terms of a companion military assistance pact, the Philippine government was prohibited from purchasing so much as a bullet from any arms source other than the United States, except with American approval. By early 1950, the United States had provided the Philippines with over $200 million worth of military equipment and supplies, a remarkable sum for that time, and was in addition to the construction of various military facilities. By September, when Lieutenant Colonel Edward G. Lansdale arrived in the Philippines, the Civil War had all the markings of a long, drawn-out affair, with victory not in sight for either side. Ostensibly, Lansdale was just another American military advisor attached to the Joint U.S. Military Advisory Group, or JUSMAG. But in actuality, he was the head of CIA clandestine and paramilitary operations in the country. His apparent success in the Philippines was to make him a recognized authority in counterinsurgency. In his later reminiscence about this period in his life, Lansdale relates his surprise at hearing from informed Filipino civilian friends about how repressive the Quirino government was, that its atrocities matched those of, or attributed to, the Hucks, that the government was, quote, rotten with corruption, end quote, down to the policeman in the street, Lansdale observed on his own. That Quirino himself had been elected the previous year through extensive fraud, and that the Hucks were right. They were the wave of the future, and the violence was the only way for the people to get a government of their own. The police wrote a correspondent for the Saturday Evening Post, were bands of uninformed thieves and rapists, more feared than bandits. The army was little better. Lansdale was undeterred. He had come to do a job. Accordingly, he told himself that if the Hucks took over, there would be only another form of injustice by another privileged few, backed by even crueler force. By the next chapter, he had convinced himself that he was working on the side of those committed to, quote, defend human liberty in the Philippines, end quote. As a former advertising man, Lansdale was no stranger to the use of market research, motivation techniques, media, and deception. In CIA parlance, such arts fall under the heading of, quote, psychological warfare, end quote. To this end, Lansdale fashioned a unit called the Civil Affairs Office. Its activities were based on the premise, one, both new and suspect to most American military officers, that a popular guerrilla army cannot be defeated by force alone. Lansdale team conducted a careful study of the superstitions of the Filipino peasants living in Huck areas. Their lore, taboos, and myths were examined for clues to the appropriate appeals that could wean them from supporting the insurgents. In one operation, Lansdale's men flew over these areas in a small plane hidden by a cloud cover and broadcast in Tagalog mysterious curses on any villagers who dared to give the Hucks food or shelter. The tactic reportedly succeeded into starving some Huck units into surrender. Another Lansdale-initiated Siwar operation played on the superstitious dread in the Philippine countryside of the Aswang, a mythical vampire. Lansdale regularly held coffee clutches with Filipino officials and military personnel in which new ideas were freely tossed back and forth, a la Madison Avenue brain session. Out of this came the Economic Development Corps to lure Hucks with a program of resettlement on their own patch of farmland, with tools, seeds, cash loans, etc. It was an undertaking wholly inadequate to the land problem, and the number that responded was very modest, but like other cyber techniques, a principal goal was to steal from the enemy his most persuasive arguments. The most insidious part of the CIA operation in the Philippines was the fundamental manipulation of the nation's political life, featuring staged managed elections and disinformation campaigns. The high point of this effort was the election to the presidency in 1953 of Ramon Magsaysay, the cooperative former Defense Department head. Lansdale, it was said, invented Magsaysay. His CIA front organizations, such as the National Movement for Free Elections, ran the Filipino campaign with all the license, impunity, and money that one would expect from the Democratic or Republican National Committee operating in the United States. Or perhaps, more to the point, Mayor Daley operating in Chicago. Yet the New York Times, in an editorial, was moved to refer to the Philippines as, quote, democracy's showcase in Asia, end quote. Once Magsaysay was in office, the CIA wrote his speeches, carefully guided his foreign policy, and used its press assets, paid editors and journalists, to provide him with a constant clack of support for his domestic programs and his involvement in the U.S.-directed anti-communist crusade in Southeast Asia. As well as to attack anti-U.S. newspaper columnists, so beholden was Magsaysay to the United States, disclosed presidential assistant Sherman Adams that he, quote, sent word to Eisenhower that he would do anything the United States wanted him to do, even though his own foreign minister took the opposite view, end quote. After Magsaysay died in a plane crash in 1957, various other Filipino politicians and parties were sought out by the CIA as clients, or offered themselves as such. One of the latter was Diosdado Macapagal, who was to become president in 1961. Macapagal provided the agency with political information for several years and eventually asked for and received what he felt he deserved: heavy financial support for his campaign. Reader's Digest called his election, quote, certainly a demonstration of democracy in action, end quote. Ironically, Macapagal had been the bittersweet objector to the American intervention in the Magsaysay election in 1953, quoting time and again from the Philippine law that, quote, no foreigner shall aid any candidate directly or indirectly, or take part in or influence in any manner any election, end quote. Perhaps even more ironic, in 1957 the Philippine government adopted a law clearly written by Americans which outlawed both the Communist Party and the Hucks, giving as one of the reasons for doing so that these organizations aimed at placing the government, quote, under control and domination of an alien power, end quote. By 1953, the Hucks were scattered and demoralized, no longer a serious threat. Although their death would be distributed over the next few years, it is difficult to ascertain to what extent their decline was due to the traditional military force employed against them, or to Lansdale's more unorthodox methods, or to the eventual debilitation of many of the Hucks from malnutrition and disease brought on by the impoverishment of the peasantry. Long before the end, many Hucks were also lacking weapons and ammunition and proper military equipment, bringing into question the oft-repeated charge of Soviet and Chinese aid to them made by Filipino and American authorities. Quote, since the destruction of the Huck military power, noted George Taylor, quote, the social and political program that made the accomplishment possible has to a large extent fallen by the wayside, end quote. Fortress America, however, was securely in place in Southeast Asia. From the Philippines would be launched American air and sea actions against Korea and China, Vietnam and Indonesia. The Philippine government would send combat forces to fight alongside the United States and Vietnam and Korea. On the island's bases, the technology and state-of-the-art counterinsurgency warfare would be imparted to the troops of America's other allies in the Pacific. If you like the video, I highly suggest checking out the book Killing Hope by William Bloom, which this video is based on. There's a link in the description. I also implore you to consider hitting the like button. If you really like the video, please consider hitting the subscribe button. If you really like the video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/CaptainWaffles. Thank you.